3,000 Jewish children disappeared from Nazi-controlled Europe. They weren't sent away on transports. They weren't discovered in the camps. They simply vanished into thin air, and the most unexpected location imaginable became their perfect refuge, a tiny Protestant community nestled in occupied France's heartland, where religious leaders and rural families turned their houses, storage buildings, and educational institutions into hidden shelters. But here's what will challenge everything. You thought you understood about the Second World War. These young people weren't concealed in underground chambers or remote woodland areas. They moved openly through town. They sat in classrooms. They enjoyed recreation in open plazas. And the German forces, despite their extensive surveillance systems and reign of fear, never discovered them. How do you conceal 3,000 human beings right out in the open? The explanation can be found in Chambon-sur-Lignon. And what you're going to learn was intentionally kept out of historical records for many years. The year was 1940. France had surrendered. The Nazi flag flew above the capital, and the puppet Vichy government made the southern region a zone of persecution. Jewish people were catalogued, identified, removed from their residences, and transported eastward in livestock wagons. Young ones were torn from their families at Drancy's entrance, the holding facility near Paris, where complete households waited for their fate. The horror followed a pattern. The German apparatus operated with precision, and amid this nightmare, there stood Le Chambon, a remote community of 5,000 people situated on the WWII highlands at 3,000 feet elevation. The weather was harsh, resources were scarce, and the population was Protestant. That final point carries more weight than you might realize. Le Chambon's residents were Huguenots, the descendants of French Protestant believers who had faced persecution, suffering, and slaughter under the Catholic crown for generations. They understood what it meant to be hunted. Their family chronicles were filled with tales of fleeing in darkness, seeking refuge in caverns, and remembering forebears executed for their beliefs. When Hitler's regime emerged and started pursuing Jewish people, the inhabitants of Le Chambon didn't view outsiders. They recognized their own ancestors from 3 centuries past, and they reached a conclusion. They refused to be bystanders this time. Never again. Everything began with a single individual, André Trocmé, the minister of the community's Reformed congregation. A tall figure, wearing round spectacles and possessing a commanding presence, Trocmé didn't fit the typical image of a wartime champion. He embraced pacifism completely, drawing inspiration from Gandhi's philosophy and the principles of peaceful resistance. However, in June of 1942, when Vichy officials started requiring ministers to announce anti-Semitic edicts during services, Trocmé took a remarkable stand. He said no, and standing at the lectern of his humble stone chapel, he announced that his parishioners were obligated to conceal, safeguard, and rescue anyone targeted by the authorities. This wasn't merely a recommendation, it was an ethical imperative. And his community, astonishingly, followed through. But what sets this account apart from every other resistance narrative you've encountered is this. It wasn't a covert mission run by a select group. It became a collective conspiracy. Agricultural workers, educators, homemakers, young people, everyone was aware, everyone took part, and everyone maintained silence. When the initial Jewish child reached the community, appearing at a farmhouse entrance during the night hours, the farmer's spouse didn't pause to consider. She welcomed her inside. Within days, 2 additional children came, followed by 5 more, then 10, and then, resembling a quiet, relentless current, they continued arriving. Young ones whose mothers and fathers had been detained, young ones who had gotten away from the transport trains, young ones whose true names were eliminated and replaced on fraudulent baptismal documents. And Le Chambon-sur-Lignon transformed into something that shouldn't have been possible, a refuge operating in the open. The question crossing your mind right now must be this. How did they accomplish such a feat? How did an entire community work against the Third Reich without being wiped out? The explanation will catch you off guard, because it centres on something the German forces never grasped: the quiet power of common citizens who determined that certain boundaries must never be violated. And before this video concludes, you'll understand precisely their methods and the reason this account nearly vanished from memory forever. The operation functioned in this manner. Information travelled through clandestine channels. A Jewish household in Lyon, frightened and pursued, might catch a whisper from a compassionate merchant or a resistance connection. Travel to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, seek out the pastor. Assistance will be provided. No specific locations, no assurances, only trust in unknown faces. And so they journeyed on foot via rail, concealed in cargo vehicles. They appeared after dark, drained and terrified, gripping counterfeit documentation or carrying nothing whatsoever. And the doorways of Le Chambon swung open, not a single entrance, but many dozens. The community had no headquarters for operations, no elaborate intelligence system. What it possessed was far more potent, a collective moral conviction. Every residence became a unit within an invisible web. And the most remarkable aspect, no one faced coercion to join. They simply made that choice. André Trocmé and his spouse Magda served as the discreet organisers of this improbable mission. Their minister's residence became a processing centre for human survival. Magda responded to knocks at every hour, welcoming desperate refugees with words that would become famous. Naturally, come in. Not perhaps, not will consider what's feasible. Simply, naturally, as though protecting the persecuted was the most self-evident action imaginable. She provided them meals, located temporary sleeping arrangements, and then within hours or days placed them throughout the community and neighbouring agricultural properties. Certain children remained with households. Others went to boarding institutions scattered across the highlands. The educational facilities managed by Protestant instructors became strongholds of invented identities. Jewish young people received different names, memorized Christian devotions, and merged into classrooms beside local youth. The teachers understood the truth. The pupils understood, and nobody spoke a word, yet the threat remained ever present and crushing. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon sat within Vichy-controlled France, meaning it fell under the authority of the collaborationist administration that enthusiastically implemented Nazi race legislation. The Gestapo moved without restriction. Betrayers existed everywhere. The community's police commander, an individual named Robert Bach, possessed the ability to dismantle the complete operation with one telephone communication. However, he chose otherwise. He joined the conspiracy. When directives arrived from regional command to gather up Jewish people, Bach would neglect to carry them out. When SS personnel came to examine the community, he would mysteriously be unable to locate anyone questionable. And when alerts came that enforcement actions were approaching, he would discreetly relay information to Trocmé, who would trigger the warning mechanism the community had established. A subtle message whispered from residence to residence, property to property. Within moments, children would disperse into the neighbouring woodlands, concealing themselves in predetermined locations until the threat subsided. The initial significant challenge arrived in August of 1942. Vichy officials, under demands from Berlin, initiated an enormous roundup of foreign Jewish people throughout the unoccupied territory. Thousands faced arrest, families were torn apart, and then the directives reached Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. Regional administrators insisted that Trocmé supply a registry of every Jewish person sheltered in the community. It represented a death sentence masked as administrative documentation. Trocmé's answer was straightforward and powerful. "We do not know what a Jew is, we only know men." He declined to supply any identities. It was an act of direct rebellion that should have led to his swift detention and death. But something unanticipated occurred. The officials held back. Why? Because Le Chambon-sur-Lignon was no longer operating in isolation. The conspiracy had expanded past the community's boundaries. Neighbouring townships and agricultural areas across the highlands had entered the network. Protestant settlements in close-by Le Mazet, Chambon-sur-Lignon and tents opened their entrances. Catholic households, motivated by the Protestants' bravery, started sheltering displaced people as well. What commenced as one minister's ethical position had spread into a regional movement of human decency. And the Vichy administration, frightened of sparking a wider rebellion in a territory already distrustful of centralized power, withdrew temporarily. But the German forces weren't oblivious, and their patience had limits. By the winter months of 1942, rumours regarding Le Chambon had climbed to the upper levels of SS leadership structure in France. Something was amiss in that mountain community. Far too many displaced persons were vanishing into the highlands. Far too many Jewish children were evading their grasp. And so in February of 1943, the Gestapo took action. A squad of officers showed up without warning, commanded by a captain called Julius Schmaling. They brought trucks, search animals, and authorization. Locate the Jewish people, detain the conspirators, and establish this community that challenged the Reich as an example. The entire mission should have required hours. It consumed weeks, and it concluded in defeat. Schmaling was no simpleton. He grasped that Le Chambon was concealing something, yet he couldn't establish proof. The children he came across on the roadways all possessed documentation. The households sheltering them all offered explanations. "This is my brother's daughter from Lyon. These are family members from Marseille." The narratives were practiced, uncomplicated, and impossible to refute without comprehensive background investigations that would require months to complete. And here's where the community members' approach demonstrated its brilliance. They never outright denied anything. They simply concealed the reality beneath multiple layers of everyday ordinariness. When Gestapo personnel searched residences, they discovered children completing schoolwork. When they examined educational facilities, they observed pupils singing Protestant hymns. Everything appeared routine. Everything sensed incorrect. But Schmaling lacked proof. And without concrete evidence, even the Gestapo couldn't operate without restraint in Vichy-controlled areas, without creating a diplomatic crisis with the collaborationist authorities. The German forces came nearest to breaking through the network on a bitter cold morning in late February. Schmaling's personnel conducted a raid on a boarding institution called Maison des Roches, a three-level structure positioned at the community's edge. They crashed through the entryways, insisting on examining identification documents for every pupil. The administrator, a lean individual named André Trocmé, André's relative, responded with composure. He presented documentation for each child. The personnel scrutinized them thoroughly, searching for discrepancies, counterfeit official marks, anything providing justification for detention. And they discovered nothing. However, as they readied to depart, one officer observed something unusual. A young boy in the corner, perhaps 12 years of age, was gripping a book against his body with pale-knuckled intensity. The officer shouted a demand, "Display the book." The boy paused. The space became silent. André Trocmé moved forward. He offered a smile, rested a hand on the young boy's shoulder, and clarified that the child was merely protective of his devotional book, a present from his deceased mother. The officer remained unconvinced. He tore the book from the boy's grasp and examined it, and there, hidden between the pages, sat a photograph, a family photograph, and the boy in the image was positioned beneath a menorah, clearly observing Hanukkah. The officer's expression showed victory. He possessed his evidence. He seized the boy by the limb and started pulling him toward the exit. The other children observed in paralyzed terror. And then André Trocmé performed an action that should have resulted in his immediate execution. He physically obstructed the exit. He informed the officer that if the boy faced arrest, he must arrest Daniel as well, because this child, he stated, remained under his guardianship, and Daniel refused to forsake him. The confrontation continued for less than 60 seconds, yet it seemed endless. The officer possessed the authority to shoot Daniel on the spot. He held complete legal authority under Nazi occupation regulations. But something prevented him. Perhaps it was the unwavering resolve in Daniel's gaze. Perhaps it was understanding that executing a school administrator before numerous observers would transform the entire Highlands into an engaged resistance territory. Or perhaps, just perhaps, even a Gestapo officer retained a fragment of humanity that recoiled from killing a man for defending a child. For whatever cause, the officer let the boy go, pushed Daniel to the side, and departed angrily. But Daniel Trocmé's identity was recorded on a list, and 6 months into the future, the Gestapo would return for him. The children, in the meantime, mastered living dual existences. During daylight, they became Marie, Pierre, Jean, upstanding Protestant young people with baptismal certificates and memorized family backgrounds. After nightfall, in hushed exchanges, in upper rooms and storage buildings, they remained Rachel, David, Sarah, clinging to pieces of their authentic identities like treasured gems. They absorbed which devotions to speak publicly and which ones to murmur privately. They committed to memory the identities of imaginary family members and the particulars of locations they'd never seen. And they absorbed the most crucial lesson of all, remaining silent. A solitary error, a solitary instant of bewilderment could destroy everything. The burden of that obligation on young people as young as 5 years is nearly impossible to comprehend. Yet they bore it because they grasped, even at such tender ages, that their continued existence relied on a flawless act. The community's children became their fellow conspirators. Protestant youth who had matured hearing accounts of their own forebears' persecution grasped instinctively what hung in the balance. They provided cover when the Jewish children's pronunciations faltered. They assisted them in memorizing Christian ceremonies. They deceived their own family members when required, and they developed authentic bonds that rose above the terror of the present. Records exist of local young boys instructing refugee children in skiing techniques, in dairy animal care, in navigating the mountain trails that could function as evacuation pathways if the Gestapo came back. These weren't gestures of sympathy. They were gestures of brotherhood. The children of Le Chambon didn't observe victims. They observed companions who simply required protection. And through that simple shift in perspective, they joined the most successful resistance unit in occupied France. The network grew in ways that challenged reason. Agricultural workers in the neighbouring hills started creating fraudulent documents in their kitchens. A local printing professional named Oskar Rosowski, himself a Jewish refugee, barely 18 years of age, became an expert falsifier, creating hundreds of counterfeit identity cards, ration documents, and baptismal certificates so persuasive they deceived even Gestapo document experts. He operated from a confined attic space using stolen administrative stamps and improvised inks created from fruit and compounds obtained from Lyon. Every document he produced represented a lifeline, and every day he laboured, he faced a firing squad. Yet he continued labouring because in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, everyone participated. There were no observers, only active members. Nourishment became another form of defiance. The highlands were impoverished, the earth was harsh, and wartime restrictions meant that even the residents scarcely had sufficient food. Yet somehow, the community nourished 3,000 additional people. Agricultural workers redirected segments of their production. Women extended broths and meals with whatever they could obtain. Underground market systems, usually operated for financial gain, were redirected towards survival, and the children, both residents and refugees, received instruction in gathering from the woodlands, collecting fungi, wild fruits, edible nuts, any source of sustenance. Hunger persisted constantly, yet starvation was prevented. It represented a logistical wonder accomplished by individuals who possessed no expertise in supply management, no resources, and no room for mistakes. They simply declined to allow the children to perish. And throughout everything, the German forces maintained their search. Enforcement actions became commonplace. Gestapo personnel would sweep through the community at unpredictable intervals, examining residences, questioning households, attempting to capture someone in deception. But the deceptions withstood scrutiny. The operation withstood pressure. And each time the personnel departed without success, the conspiracy expanded with greater confidence. By the spring season of 1943, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon wasn't merely concealing displaced persons any longer. It was actively transporting them beyond France's borders completely. Escorts, numerous of them local adolescents, started conducting groups of children across the mountains toward neutral Switzerland. The expeditions were punishing. 30 miles travelling by foot through frozen conditions, evading frontier patrols, resting in natural caverns. Yet hundreds succeeded in crossing, and Le Chambon became more than a sanctuary. It transformed into a passage toward liberation. The Swiss frontier passages represented nightmares disguised as possibility. The trek from Le Chambon-sur-Lignon to the boundary required 3 days walking through landscape that posed equal danger to a German bullet. Escorts, frequently scarcely older than the children they guided, committed to memory patrol timetables, paid off border personnel when feasible, and depended on systems of understanding, farmers who would conceal groups in storage buildings when patrols moved through. The children travelled in single formation, prohibited from making sounds, their footwear covered in fabric to silence their steps. If a child lost footing or made noise, the complete group faced compromise. And the Swiss, despite their declared neutrality, weren't guaranteed supporters. Frontier personnel frequently returned refugees, condemning them to capture and transportation. But the escorts from Le Chambon understood which passages were vulnerable, which personnel averted their gaze, and which mountain routes remained unwatched at sunrise. It represented a fatal gamble. But for those who crossed successfully, Switzerland signified survival. Back in the community, André Trocmé understood his remaining time was limited. The Gestapo hadn't disregarded him. His refusal to cooperate, his open defiance, had established him as a target. In the summer months of 1943, alerts reached him through resistance communication channels. A detention directive had been authorized. He possessed the option to escape, enter concealment, maintain his activities from the shadows. But departing Le Chambon-sur-Lignon would communicate fear. It would encourage the authorities. It would communicate to the community members that even their minister, the individual who had initiated this conspiracy, believed the end had arrived. So Trocmé executed a calculated risk. He entered partial concealment, remaining in the community but relocating between secure residences, never resting in identical locations consecutively. It represented a balance between continuation and representation. He stayed visible sufficiently to motivate, invisible sufficiently to prevent capture. For months, the strategy succeeded. But in August of 1943, the Gestapo executed a trap. Personnel encircled the minister's residence at sunrise, anticipating discovering Trocmé sleeping. Instead, they discovered his spouse, Magda, composed and steady, providing breakfast to a group of refugee children. The personnel insisted on knowing her husband's location. She communicated the reality. She lacked knowledge. They dismantled the residence, examined every space, questioned the children. Nothing. Enraged, they detained Magda instead, transporting her to the regional Gestapo command center in Le Puy. It represented a hostage circumstance. The communication was transparent. Surrender yourself or your spouse faces consequences. And for the initial time since the conspiracy commenced, André Trocmé confronted a decision possessing no favorable resolution. Submit himself and the network loses its commander. Remain concealed and his spouse could face torture or death. He submitted himself. Within hours, Trocmé entered Gestapo command and surrendered. He faced immediate detention alongside his fellow pastor, Edouard Theiss, and the administrator, Roger d'Arcissac. The 3 individuals were placed in a holding facility in Saint-Paul-des-Jours, a detention location for political detainees awaiting transportation to Germany. For the community members of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, it appeared like the conclusion. Their minister, their ethical guide, had vanished. The Gestapo had ultimately prevailed. But here's what the German forces failed to comprehend. Le Chambon was never reliant on a single individual. Trocmé had ignited the flame, but the community had become the fuel. The network didn't crumble, it transformed. Magda Trocmé, released following her husband's surrender, assumed coordination responsibilities. Additional ministers advanced. Agricultural workers, educators, and homemakers who had been following directives now issued them. The conspiracy didn't merely endure André's detention, it intensified. And then something remarkable transpired. International demands started mounting. The detention of 3 Protestant ministers for the offence of protecting children transformed into a publicity catastrophe for Vichy. The World Council of Churches, neutral administrations, even certain Catholic bishops started voicing opposition. The Vichy administration, already navigating a precarious balance between German demands and preserving an appearance of French independence, recognized they had committed an error. Trocmé and his associates were excessively visible, excessively symbolic. Their execution or transportation would convert them into martyrs and spark demonstrations across unoccupied France. So, following 5 weeks of confinement, the 3 individuals were discreetly freed. No accusations, no clarification, simply an admonishment. Exercise greater caution. They came back to Le Chambon as champions, and the conspiracy, now impossible to stop, surged into its concluding and most perilous stage. By the winter of 1943, the complete highlands had converted into a resistant stronghold, masked as pastoral agricultural territory. What had commenced as a community conspiracy now extended across numerous settlements. Le Mazet, Saint-Agrève, Fay-sur-Lignon, Tence, all transformed into connection points in an underground passage that channeled thousands of displaced persons towards security. The Gestapo understood something was occurring. They could sense it, yet they couldn't observe it. The network functioned without documented records, without radio transmissions, without anything capable of being intercepted or followed. Directives were communicated verbally. Secure residences rotated weekly. And the most incriminating proof, the children themselves, concealed in the open, their fraudulent identities so thoroughly integrated into community existence that even adjacent residents couldn't distinguish who was authentic and who was fabricated. It represented counterintelligence, executed by common individuals who had never encountered the concept. The falsifier, Oskar Rosowski, had transformed into a phantom legend. Nobody knew his actual identity. Most community members had never observed his appearance, but his creations circulated like underground currency. An agricultural worker would obtain a package containing 20 blank identification cards. An educator would discover baptismal certificates placed beneath her entrance. A household concealing displaced persons would awaken to find recently forged ration documents on their kitchen surface. Rosowski laboured in isolation, confiding in nobody, relocating between upper rooms and storage buildings, perpetually one step ahead of the Gestapo operations that arrived with growing regularity. He was 19 years of age, and his falsifications were so flawless that following the war, French officials would face challenges determining which documents were authentic and which were his productions. He preserved lives with ink and parchment, functioning in obscurity, never requesting acknowledgement, and he nearly faced capture numerous times. The children, now totaling in the thousands, when including those in neighbouring communities, established their own survival practices. They invented coded communication for threats. An educator inscribing a particular phrase on a teaching board signified enforcement action approaching, disperse. A chapel bell sounded at an unusual hour, signified conceal immediately. They created emergency meeting locations in the woodlands identified with markers only they comprehended, and they mastered reading adults for indicators of tension or anxiety, grasping that their survival relied on perpetual awareness. Certain of these children were as young as 4 years of age, yet they maintained the operational discretion of trained agents. Accounts exist of Gestapo personnel questioning children who preserved their fabricated narratives under interrogation with a self-control that disturbed their questioners. These weren't battle-hardened resistance operatives. They were young people who comprehended that a single error signified death for everyone they cared about. The neighbouring woodland became a secondary community. Natural caverns, deserted herders' shelters, and thick undergrowth were converted into crisis refuges, supplied with coverings, preserved provisions, and first aid materials. When enforcement actions grew more intense, complete groups of children would disappear into the woods for extended periods, watched over by older adolescents or young adults who understood every pathway and concealment location. They absorbed how to travel soundlessly through the vegetation, to identify the noise of German machinery from great distances, to rest in alternating periods so someone remained alert constantly. It represented a dual existence, partially within civilization, partially within the wild, and the woodlands preserved their mysteries. Many years afterward, people walking the trails would continue finding remnants of these encampments. Corroded containers, decayed coverings, youthful engravings in tree surface, identifying secure pathways, tangible proof of an improbable continuation. However, the threat didn't originate solely from the German forces. Betrayers existed in every corner. Vichy supporters, French collaborationists, and common citizens, driven by terror or avarice, possessed the power to dismantle the network, with one denunciation. And certain individuals attempted. Unnamed correspondence reached Gestapo command, alleging particular agricultural properties were concealing Jewish people. Information was communicated to Vichy authorities. The network experienced casualties. Households faced detention. Certain children were captured during movements and transported away. But here's the extraordinary element. The community members never struck back against suspected betrayers with force. They separated them socially, barred them from the conspiracy, yet declined to execute or injure them. Even during the bleakest periods, Le Chambon preserved its pacifist convictions. It represented resistance, absent retribution, safeguarding absent brutality. And somehow, against all odds, it continued functioning. June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied military forces attacked the Normandy coastline, and the German occupation of France commenced its gradual, brutal disintegration. However, freedom didn't reach everywhere simultaneously. For Le Chambon and the Highlands, the summer of 44 transformed into the most perilous phase of the complete conflict. The Gestapo, recognizing their remaining time was limited, amplified their missions with frantic intensity. SS divisions, withdrawing from the progressing Allies, moved through the territory, pursuing resistance combatants and Jewish people with a cruelty emerging from approaching loss. Communities suspected of sheltering partisans faced burning. Captives were killed in open plazas, and Le Chambon, with its 4-year history of opposition, positioned itself directly in danger. The conspiracy had endured the peak of German authority. Now it needed to endure their final struggles. On June 29th, precisely 3 weeks following D-Day, the Gestapo arrived for André Trocmé. They hadn't disregarded the school administrator who had obstructed an exit and declined to release a Jewish child. Personnel conducted a raid on the Maison des Roches at sunrise, removed Daniel from his quarters, and detained him alongside 18 pupils, all of them Jewish, all of them exposed by an informant whose name stays unidentified to the present day. Daniel was moved to the Compiègne transit facility, then transported to the Majdanek concentration facility in occupied Poland. He never came back. On April 2nd, 1945, mere weeks prior to the facility's freedom, Daniel Trocmé perished in the extermination chambers. He was 31 years of age. His concluding documented statement, based on a fellow detainee who endured, were directions to care for the children. Even in Majdanek, even confronting death, he continued safeguarding them. The information of Daniel's detention transmitted shock throughout le Chambon-sur-Lignon. For the initial time, the community experienced the complete force of German retaliation. Mothers and fathers who had placed their children with the network started to fear. Certain individuals insisted their children be returned. Others pleaded for them to be relocated instantly to Switzerland. The meticulously preserved composure that had sustained the conspiracy, together for 4 years, started to split. And then André Trocmé performed something that redefined bravery. She organized a gathering in the community plaza. She positioned herself before hundreds of frightened individuals and communicated the reality. Daniel had vanished. The Gestapo was intensifying their efforts. The dangers were now catastrophic. And then she stated this: "We will not cease. We will not release a solitary child. And anyone wishing to depart the network can accomplish so presently, with no criticism." She paused. Nobody stirred, not a single individual. The conspiracy remained intact. August delivered torment to the highlands. A portion of an SS division, escaping American military, advancing from the southern region, occupied the area and imposed harsh authority. They killed suspected resistance participants immediately. They incinerated agricultural properties suspected of concealing weapons, and they positioned le Chambon-sur-Lignon under direct military observation. For 6 weeks, the community existed under occupation within occupation. SS personnel patrolling roadways, executing residence-to-residence examinations, questioning anyone appearing questionable. The children couldn't travel to the woodlands any longer. The frontiers were blocked. Evacuation pathways were eliminated. They needed to conceal within the community itself, in locations so confined and lacking ventilation that certain individuals spent weeks in upper rooms or underground spaces, never observing sunshine. It represented the ultimate challenge of the network's resourcefulness. And somehow, impossibly, not a solitary Jewish child was found during those 6 weeks. The transformation arrived from an unanticipated origin. A German personnel member named Sergeant Julius Schmaling, the identical individual who had commanded the unsuccessful raid in 43. Schmaling, presently disillusioned and confronting inevitable loss, executed a decision that continues to resist clarification. He commenced discreetly alerting the community when enforcement actions were scheduled. He created false documentation to his commanders, asserting examinations had located nothing. And in late August, days prior to the SS division's withdrawal, he entered the minister's residence and communicated to André Trocmé directly. "Remove them immediately. I cannot safeguard you further." Why did he perform this action? Was it remorse, self-interest, a final attempt at humanity before the conclusion? Nobody understands. Schmaling vanished following the conflict, never to be located, but his alert provided the network 48 hours. And during those 2 days, the community executed the most extensive evacuation of its complete mission, transporting over 200 children to Switzerland in a solitary convoy. It was reckless, it was frantic, and it succeeded. September 1944. The SS divisions withdrew eastward, destroying bridges and rail lines as they escaped. American military reached the highlands, and Le Chambon was ultimately officially freed. The community members flooded into the roadways, rejoicing with a relief so intense it approached disbelief. They had accomplished it. They had endured. But the rejoicing was subdued, burdened by weariness and grief. Daniel Trocmé had vanished. Numerous community members had faced detention, questioning, physical harm. Households had been separated, and the children, the 3,000 existences they had safeguarded, remained present, still concealed, still frightened, because freedom didn't signify security. Not yet. Numerous children possessed no residences for return. Their mothers and fathers had been transported, killed in facilities whose identities they were only starting to discover. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, the magnitude of the Holocaust was just surfacing, and with it arrived a terrible understanding. The children of Chambon-sur-Lignon were orphaned, and the community that had concealed them now needed to determine what followed next. André Trocmé declined to allow them to be transferred to orphan institutions or displaced individual facilities. She contended with an intensity that astonished even the American relief personnel that these children had already experienced uprooting excessively numerous times. They had been separated from their mothers and fathers, deprived of their identities, compelled to exist as phantoms. They didn't require another institution, they required constancy. So she advanced an audacious recommendation. Allow the children to remain in Chambon-sur-Lignon. Allow the households who had concealed them to persist in caring for them until family members could be located or appropriate residences organized. The American officials were doubtful. How could an impoverished mountain community, already extended past capability, persist in nourishing and sheltering hundreds of refugee children in the turbulent aftermath of conflict? But Magda didn't request authorization. She simply persisted in performing what she had been accomplishing for 4 years, and the community followed her direction. For months, Le Chambon transformed into a peculiar transitional location, partially refugee facility, partially community, partially orphan institution. Red Cross personnel reached, recording the children, pursuing surviving family members, attempting to reconstruct destroyed households. Certain children were brought together with mothers and fathers who had miraculously endured the facilities. Those instances were heartbreaking and jubilant in equal proportion. Emaciated mothers holding children they hadn't observed in 3 years. Fathers crying at the vision of sons and daughters they believed were deceased. But for every bringing together, there existed 10 children who lingered by the minister's residence entrance, anticipating information that never arrived. And gradually, agonizingly, they started to comprehend that their mothers and fathers were never returning. The community members who had endangered everything to preserve these existences now needed to assist them in mourning. Certain children remained in Le Chambon indefinitely. Households who had concealed them for years officially took them in, nurturing them as their biological children. Protestant agricultural workers became fathers to Jewish young people, instructing them to care for livestock and work the land. Educators who had created false documentation became substitute mothers, assisting traumatized youth in reconstructing their identities. And in among the most extraordinary gestures of cultural preservation, the community created space for the children to reclaim their Jewish heritage. Religious services were conducted in the Protestant chapel. Jewish observances were honored openly for the initial time in 5 years. The community members who had concealed these children by rendering them invisible now labored to render them complete again. It represented a collective gesture of restoration that continued years and demanded a depth of understanding that resisted quantification. And then arrived the inquiry nobody wished to pose. What regarding accountability? Who would face consequences for the informants, the collaborationists, the Vichy administrators who had pursued these children? France was dividing itself in post-war eliminations, killing collaborators, removing the hair of women who had intimate relations with German personnel, resolving conflicts with collective brutality. But Le Chambon-sur-Lignon declined to engage. André Trocmé came back from his confinement, and appalled by the killings he observed in different territories, he communicated forgiveness from his lectern. He contended that retribution would contaminate the very convictions the community had struggled to maintain. Certain community members held opposing views. Certain individuals desired identities, legal proceedings, consequences, but the preponderance remained resolute. They had opposed with peaceful means. They would reconstruct with peaceful means. It represented a decision that troubled certain survivors for their remaining existences, but it also represented a decision that permitted Le Chambon-sur-Lignon to stay Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a location characterized not by whom it eliminated, but by whom it preserved. The world didn't wish to learn about Le Chambon, not initially. In the direct aftermath of the conflict, the prevailing account was one of heroic Allied military and vanquished German forces. There existed minimal interest for narratives regarding quiet communities that had simply performed the correct action. France, eager to reconstruct its national dignity following the degradation of occupation, concentrated on celebrating the armed opposition, the Maquis combatants who had damaged rail lines and killed German personnel. Pacifist ministers who concealed children didn't align with the account. They didn't attack coastlines or detonate bridges. They simply opened entrances and deceived authorities. And so Le Chambon-sur-Lignon was disregarded. No decorations, no public celebrations, no administrative acknowledgement. The community members came back to agricultural work and instruction, and the children they had preserved dispersed throughout the globe, carrying narratives that nobody wished to broadcast. André Trocmé dedicated his remaining existence grappling with what had transpired. He never asserted to be a champion. In reality, he resisted the term. In discussions many years afterward, he would maintain that what Le Chambon accomplished wasn't remarkable. It was simply human decency confronting inhuman wickedness. He declined to receive commendations, rejected ceremonial positions, and became progressively withdrawn. The burden of Daniel's death troubled him. The awareness that while he endured, his relative had perished, safeguarding the identical children, generated a remorse that never completely recovered. Magda also faced difficulties. She experienced disturbing dreams for years, visions of Gestapo personnel removing children from her residence, visions of transport trains departing for facilities she couldn't prevent. The psychological injury of existing 4 years at the boundary of disaster doesn't simply disappear with freedom. And for the Trocmés, similar to numerous others in the community, the quiet that succeeded the conflict was nearly as agonizing as the fear that had come before it. It required nearly 40 years for the globe to uncover what Le Chambon had accomplished. In 1980, an American documentary creator named Pierre Sauvage journeyed to the community. Sauvage himself was among the children preserved by the network. Born in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in 1944 to Jewish mothers and fathers who had located safety there, he had matured in America, understanding only pieces of his origin narrative. But as a grown individual, he became fixated on an inquiry. How had a complete community conspired to preserve existences when the remainder of Europe averted their gaze? His documentary, Weapons of the Spirit, ultimately presented Le Chambon's narrative to a worldwide viewership. And what Sauvage uncovered astounded him. The community members still didn't believe they had accomplished anything particular. When he questioned elderly agricultural workers and educators, they consistently stated variations of the identical sentiment. We simply performed what anyone would accomplish, except naturally, nearly nobody else did. The acknowledgement, when it ultimately arrived, came in successive movements. In 1990, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust remembrance site, proclaimed the complete community of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon righteous among the nations. The sole occasion the distinction has been granted to a complete settlement rather than specific persons. Survivors who had been concealed as children started coming back to the highlands, presently elderly themselves, pursuing the households who had preserved them. Emotional bringings together occurred on farmhouse thresholds. Former refugee children, presently professors, physicians, creators, held the presently elderly agricultural workers who had provided them food portions during the conflict. And the narrative started to surface completely. Not sanitized, not heroic, but authentic narratives of terror, insufficient nourishment, narrow escapes, and impossible decisions. Narratives of common individuals who simply declined to acknowledge that mass killing was unavoidable. But even with acknowledgement arrived inquiries that continue to trouble historians presently. How did 3,000 individuals preserve a secret for 4 years? How did a complete territory conspire, absent a solitary catastrophic exposure? The explanation, frustratingly, is that nobody understands with certainty. There exists no instruction manual. No strategic design was ever located. The conspiracy was verbal, decentralized, and created spontaneously. It succeeded because it possessed no commander to detain, no command center to assault, no documented records to confiscate. It succeeded because every solitary individual selected independently to engage. And that selection duplicated thousands of occasions by thousands of individuals, generated something the German forces could never penetrate, a practice of opposition so profoundly integrated that it transformed into indistinguishable from everyday existence. The community didn't conceal children. The community transformed into the concealment location. Presently, Le Chambon appears similar to any different small French community. Stone residences gather around a humble chapel. Agricultural properties scatter the neighbouring hills. Visitors move through in warm months, travelling the mountain pathways, unaware they're walking trails that formerly functioned as evacuation pathways for pursued children. But if you understand where to search, the recollection stays. A compact museum records the conspiracy. Memorial markers identify the residences of central figures. And annually, on a cold morning in February, survivors and their offspring assemble in the community plaza to remember. Certain individuals are in their 80s presently, the final living observers to what transpired here. They come back to express gratitude to a location that preserved their existences and to guarantee that the narrative doesn't perish with them. Because Le Chambon-sur-Lignon's greatest concern isn't being disregarded by the globe. It's being remembered as holy figures. The community members never desired to be remarkable. They desired to be ordinary. And that's precisely what renders their narrative so crushing. Here's what the historical records won't communicate to you. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon succeeded because it dismissed the assumption that there existed only 2 selections during the Holocaust: cooperate or oppose with force. The community located a third pathway: peaceful rebellion at magnitude. They didn't damage German operations. They simply declined to engage in mass killing. And that refusal, increased across a complete settlement, demonstrated more successful than any explosive or projectile. It's a teaching that frightens administrations and motivates revolutionaries in equal proportion. Because if one impoverished community in occupied France could preserve 3,000 existences without discharging a weapon, what does that communicate regarding every different location that asserted powerlessness? What does it communicate regarding the millions who maintained they possessed no selection? Le Chambon-sur-Lignon established that selection perpetually exists, and that's a threatening reality for those who benefit from compliance. The children who endured Le Chambon transported the conspiracy into their personal existences. They transformed into educators, physicians, advocates, creators. Numerous committed their professions to human rights labour, refugee support, and Holocaust instruction. They married, produced children of their possession, and communicated to their youth regarding the Protestant agricultural workers who had concealed them in storage buildings and instructed them in dairy animal care. Those second-generation narratives are presently being transferred to a third generation. Grandchildren of survivors who never encountered the community members but inherited their ethical understanding. And in a globe progressively separated by nationalism, fear of outsiders, and the vilification of displaced persons, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon's illustration has transformed into more applicable, not less. Every occasion A government blocks its frontiers to protection seekers. Every occasion, a political leader asserts that safeguarding the defenseless is excessively threatening or excessively costly. Someone indicates a small community on a French highlands and inquires, if they could accomplish it with nothing, why cannot we? But here's the discomforting reality that survivors themselves will communicate to you. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon was an irregularity. It shouldn't have functioned. The probabilities of achievement were minuscule. One informant possessing resentment. One Gestapo personnel willing to slaughter a complete community as an illustration. One operational disintegration, and the complete network would have fallen. Thousands would have perished. And the globe would have never understood their identities. The community members succeeded not because they possessed a flawless design, but because they declined to relinquish their convictions even when defeat appeared inevitable. That's not a tactical approach, it's a wager. And most occasions throughout historical records, that wager fails disastrously. We remember Le Chambon because it's the anomaly. And we must remember the innumerable different locations. The communities that attempted to oppose and faced burning. The households that concealed displaced persons and faced execution. The networks that faced exposure and elimination. Their bravery was no less authentic. Their defeat doesn't reduce their decency, but it does remind us that virtue doesn't ensure continuation. Occasionally, wickedness prevails, and yet Le Chambon-sur-Lignon persists, not as a fantasy narrative with a flawless conclusion, but as confirmation that even in humanity's bleakest moment, certain individuals decline to allow the bleakness to prevail. 3,000 children existed because 5,000 community members determined that certain boundaries cannot be violated. No administration directed them to perform. No military safeguarded them. They simply observed children in threat and opened their entrances. That's the narrative. That's the secret they concealed right out in the open. And presently, you understand why it was nearly eliminated. Because it's a narrative that requests excessive amounts from us. It requests us to envision what we would accomplish if the knock arrived at our entrance. It requests whether we would endanger everything for an unknown person's child. And it declines to allow us to accept that weakness is ever the sole alternative. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon didn't simply preserve 3,000 existences. It preserved the concept that common individuals, armed with nothing except moral conviction, can position themselves against empires. And that concept, more than any structure or remembrance site, is the authentic weapon of the spirit that continues to resonate across the highlands.